The Last Hope, 5 to 7 minute hook. The galaxy was dying. For centuries, peaceful civilizations had flourished in the far reaches of space, exchanging knowledge, culture, and technology. But now, everything was changing. War had spread like a wildfire, tearing apart once thriving planets. The advanced technologies that had once brought prosperity now served only to fuel destruction. The galaxy was in chaos. On a distant planet called Solaris, the leaders of the alien civilizations met in secret. Their once united front had crumbled under the pressure of endless wars. Cities burned, fleets were destroyed, and entire species faced extinction. The enemy they fought was relentless, unyielding in their pursuit of total domination. No matter how hard the aliens fought, they could not stop the enemy from advancing. Hope seemed like a distant memory. At the center of the council chamber, the leader of the Silurian people, Kirak, stood tall but weary. His once proud species had been reduced to a shell of its former self. Their military was shattered, their cities ruined, and their people living in fear. Kirak had fought alongside many of the galaxy's greatest leaders, but even he could feel the weight of despair closing in. Is there any hope left? Kirak's voice echoed in the quiet chamber. His words hung heavy in the air, as though everyone present was afraid to answer. Silence filled the room. The council leaders, each from different worlds, shifted uneasily. The fate of their people rested on their shoulders. They had tried every possible means of defense, from new weapons to ancient war tactics, but nothing worked. The enemy was simply too strong, too numerous. It seemed like they had no choice but to accept their inevitable fate. But in the back of the room, a young officer named Lyra stood up. Her eyes, full of both fear and hope, locked with Kirak's. "We have one last option," Lyra said softly. Her voice barely reached the others, but it was enough to grab their attention. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to Lyra. What could she possibly suggest? They had already exhausted every option. What was left? Lyra hesitated for a moment, then continued. "We can send a distress signal, a call for help to the only force in the galaxy capable of turning the tide. The Deathworlders." At the mention of the Deathworlders, a collective gasp swept through the room. The Deathworlders were legends, a race of beings who lived on the most dangerous planets in the galaxy. They were feared by all who knew of them. Their strength, brutality, and cunning were unmatched. No one dared to cross them, for they were the ultimate survivors. Many stories circulated about them, some exaggerated, others true. But no one had ever dared to ask for their help. To call upon them was considered a death sentence. Kirak's heart sank as he stared at Lyra. He knew the stories too well. The Deathworlders were ruthless. They did not care about anyone but themselves. They fought only for survival, and to them, the rest of the galaxy was just another battlefield. Asking them for help was a dangerous gamble. "The Deathworlders?" Kirak whispered. "Are you suggesting we make contact with them? Do you think they will help us?" Lyra nodded. "They are known for their power. If they answer our call, they could turn the tide of this war." There was a long pause, and Kirak could see the doubt in the eyes of the council members. They were all afraid of what would happen if they reached out to the Deathworlders. But what choice did they have? The enemy was closing in, and they were running out of time. Kirak looked around at the council members. He saw the fear, the uncertainty, and the desperation in their eyes. But he also saw something else. Hope, a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, the Deathworlders could be the key to saving them all. "If we do this," Kirak said slowly, "we must understand the risks. We do not know what the Deathworlders will do. They are not like us. They are not bound by the same codes of honor or compassion. But if there is even the smallest chance that they can help us, then we must take it. For the sake of our people, we must take that chance." The room was quiet as the council members exchanged glances. Finally, one by one, they nodded in agreement. There was no turning back now. They had to send the message. Lyra quickly moved to a console at the side of the room. She typed in the coordinates of the Deathworlders' last known location, sending the distress signal into the vastness of space. As the message transmitted, the room fell into a heavy silence. Kirok stood by the window, looking out at the stars. A part of him hoped that the Deathworlders would never answer. They were dangerous, unpredictable. But another part of him clung to the hope that they would come, that they would save them, and that just maybe, the galaxy could be saved from the brink of destruction. The signal is sent. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. The vast chamber where the council had met now felt more like a tomb. The leaders of the galaxy's civilizations had made their decision. They had placed their faith in the hands of the Deathworlders, a race they knew little about, but hoped could be the galaxy's salvation. Kirok stood motionless by the window, staring out at the black void of space, wondering if they had made the right choice. Lyra remained by the console, her fingers hovering over the controls. The distress signal had been sent, but there was no guarantee that anyone on the other side would even respond. The Deathworlders were notoriously difficult to reach. Some said they lived on planets so hostile that no other civilization dared venture near them. The few who had managed to make contact with them often spoke of a brutal, unforgiving race. For hours, there was nothing but silence. The council members continued to discuss what their next move should be if the Deathworlders did not respond. But deep down, they all knew it was a long shot. They were on the brink of destruction, and their last hope lay in the hands of a distant and dangerous race. But then the console beeped. A low, resonating hum filled the room, drawing everyone's attention. Lyra's eyes widened as the message came through. It's them," she exclaimed, barely able to contain her excitement. Kirok's heart skipped a beat. The others gathered around as Lyra quickly opened the transmission. A harsh, grating voice crackled through the speakers, the language rough but unmistakable. "This is the Deathworlder fleet. You've made a dangerous mistake." Kirok's breath caught in his throat. The voice was cold, emotionless. It sent a chill down his spine. The Deathworlders had answered, but there was no warmth in their response. "We are coming," the voice continued. "Prepare yourselves. You will need to prove your worth." With that, the transmission ended. The room fell silent once more. "They're coming," Lyra whispered, her voice trembling. But what did they mean by prove your worth? Kirok's mind raced. The Deathworlders hadn't given them any guarantees, no promises of help, only the chilling words, "Prove your worth." What could that possibly mean? Were they to fight for their survival? Were they to offer something in return? He didn't know. All he knew was that the Deathworlders were on their way. The room was filled with a mixture of emotions, relief that the Deathworlders had heard their call, and fear at the unknown nature of what would come next. The galaxy's fate was now tied to a race that operated by their own rules. There was no telling what the Deathworlders would do when they arrived. Kirok looked around the room at the other council members. Some were hopeful, others were fearful, but all were waiting. Waiting for the arrival of the Deathworlder fleet, and for whatever consequences that would bring. Hours turned into days. The silence was unbearable. The galaxy's leaders, once so full of purpose, now found themselves uncertain. Had they made the right decision? Would the Deathworlders actually come? Would they be the saviors they hoped for, or the harbingers of more destruction? As the days passed, strange reports started to come in. Ships from various corners of the galaxy had detected unusual readings, unexplained disturbances in space. Some claimed to have seen flashes of light, strange signals, and a sense of something approaching from the dark reaches of space. The atmosphere grew tense. No one could say for sure what it meant, but they all knew one thing: the Deathworlders were coming. In the council chamber, Kirok stood once again, looking out at the stars. The silence felt heavy, oppressive. But then, just as he was about to speak, the console beeped again. A new message had come through. "This is the Deathworlder fleet. We are nearing your position. Prepare yourselves. We will arrive within the hour." The room froze. The finality of the words hung in the air like a weight. The Deathworlders were coming. And whatever was about to unfold, it was beyond anyone's control now. Kirak took a deep breath, his mind racing with thoughts of what the Deathworlders' arrival would mean. Would they save the galaxy, or destroy it further? Could they really be trusted? The questions were endless, but one thing was certain. The galaxy's fate rested in the hands of these mysterious beings. The Deathworlder fleet approaches. The galaxy had been waiting for this moment for days. The transmissions had grown more frequent, each one sending a ripple of both fear and hope through the leaders of the galaxy. The Deathworlders, the most feared and respected force in the galaxy, were approaching. But the questions still lingered. What would they do when they arrived? Kirak paced back and forth in the council chamber, his eyes fixed on the blinking lights of the console. Each signal from the Deathworlders brought with it a mix of dread and anticipation. He could see the anxiety on the faces of the council members around him. They had placed all their hopes on these ruthless warriors. Now, the moment was upon them. "They're nearly here," Lyra whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of excitement and fear. Kirak turned toward her. "We don't know what to expect," he said, trying to steady his own nerves. "The Deathworlders may not be what we hoped for. They might have their own agenda, one we won't be able to control." "Perhaps," Lyra replied, her eyes fixed on the screen. "But what other choice do we have?" The Deathworlders were known for their brutality, their strength, and their unyielding determination. They had conquered entire planets, wiped out entire civilizations, and emerged victorious in every conflict they had faced. But for all their terrifying reputation, they were also survivors. And in a galaxy on the brink of destruction, that survival instinct was exactly what Kirak and the others needed. The council members continued to debate what actions they should take when the fleet arrived. Some suggested preparing for a full-scale evacuation, while others wanted to meet the fleet head-on, to try and show strength in the face of the unknown. But no matter what the council decided, the fate of the galaxy would be decided by the Deathworlders' next move. Kirak looked out the window at the stars, his thoughts racing. There was a part of him that couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to him. The Deathworlders didn't operate on the same terms as everyone else. They were cold, pragmatic, and efficient. The galaxy might not even survive their presence, let alone their help. Yet, they had no other choice. The alternative was certain death. As if in response to his thoughts, the console beeped again, and a new message flashed across the screen. It was brief, to the point, and sent a chill through Kirak's spine. "This is the Deathworlder fleet," the voice crackled. "We have arrived." The room fell into an eerie silence. For a moment, no one moved. The message had come. The Deathworlders were here. But now what? Kirak could hear the low hum of the fleet's ships outside, their presence almost palpable. The vibrations beneath his feet, the steady pulse of the engines, were like the beating of a drum heralding an unknown future. Lyra stepped forward, her eyes wide. "What do we do now?" Kirak took a deep breath. "We wait." But waiting was no easy task. The tension was unbearable. Each passing minute felt like an eternity. The leaders of the galaxy were all well-versed in diplomacy and strategy, but none of their skills could prepare them for what was about to unfold. Outside, the Deathworlder ships loomed in the vastness of space, their shapes monstrous and imposing. They were unlike any ships the galaxy had ever seen, dark, menacing, and designed for war. They were not here to negotiate or make alliances. They were here for one purpose, and one purpose only: to survive, and to ensure that the galaxy would survive with them. The fleet hovered in place, waiting for the next move. Kirak could feel the weight of their presence, pressing down on him like a physical force. He had never been this close to the Deathworlders before. It was one thing to hear about them from afar, to hear the stories of their strength and their power. It was another thing entirely to know that they were here, right outside their door, and that the fate of the galaxy now rested in their hands. The minutes passed, each one stretching longer than the last. Finally, the silence was broken by a voice that came through the ship's communication system, loud and clear. It was deep, gravelly, and carried an edge of something Kirok couldn't quite place, something that both terrified and fascinated him. "We have arrived," the voice said again. "You have called. We will answer. But remember, the price for our aid is steep, and we will not be here forever." Kirok's heart pounded in his chest. What did they mean by the price? What would the Deathworlders demand in exchange for their help? There was so much he didn't know, so much that could go wrong. But in that moment, as the Deathworlder fleet loomed outside, Kirok understood one thing. The galaxy had gambled everything on this moment. And now they would see if their gamble would pay off, or if it would all come crashing down. "Prepare yourself," Kirok said, his voice steady but filled with tension. "We are about to face the price of survival." The Deathworlder fleet was no longer just a looming threat in the distance. Their ships were now positioned above the planet, their massive structures blotting out the stars, creating an almost suffocating presence. The whole galaxy was waiting with bated breath. The Alliance leaders, standing in the chamber, shared one common thought. What would the Deathworlders demand in exchange for their help? Kirok, the Council's leader, stood still, his eyes locked on the holographic projection of the fleet. The silence in the room was deafening, and the fear that had once been a whisper was now a roar. The future of their galaxy was in the hands of these merciless beings, and they knew all too well that the Deathworlders did not make deals lightly. They never did. But if there was even a shred of hope, it was in the hands of those who thrived on destruction and war. Lyra, standing beside him, could barely contain her anxiety. "What are they waiting for, Kirok?" Her voice was a mix of fear and curiosity, every second stretching out longer than the last. "They're assessing us," Kirok replied, his voice low and steady. "These Deathworlders don't help without a price, and it won't be something simple. They'll want something we can't possibly predict, something that will leave us with no choice but to comply." His words hung heavily in the air, as the realization dawned upon the Council. What would the Deathworlders ask for? The galaxy had no choice but to trust them, but the price could be far greater than they had bargained for. Kirok's mind raced. He had fought in wars, navigated political treacheries, and brokered deals that seemed impossible. But the Deathworlders, they were beyond anything he had ever dealt with. They were a force of nature. Legends had spoken of their ruthlessness, their willingness to conquer, to destroy, and to claim. Now, the galaxy would be at the mercy of their will. Suddenly, the ship's communication system flared to life again, sending a shockwave of anticipation through the room. The voice that crackled over the speakers was gruff, its words punctuated by the unmistakable strength that radiated from the Deathworlders. "This is the Deathworlder fleet," the voice began, cold and direct. "You have called upon us. We answer." Kirok's pulse quickened. This was it, the moment they would learn what the Deathworlders demanded. A new image flickered on the holographic projector, showing a vast figure in a dark, battle-worn armor. The Deathworlder leader, Kirok realized. His voice boomed through the chamber. "We come to offer you our strength," the figure said, "but we are not merciful. There is a price for everything. You sought our aid, but now you will understand the cost of that decision." Lyra stepped forward, her eyes wide with fear. "What do you want from us?" she asked, her voice trembling but firm. The Deathworlder leader's eyes glinted coldly. "You have two choices. You will give us control over your most valuable resource, or we will leave. And when we leave, we will leave you to face the wrath of the galaxy alone. Your choice will determine your survival. We do not come to negotiate. We come to take." The room was filled with stunned silence. The galaxy's leaders, who had put all their hopes into this moment, now found themselves on the precipice of a decision that could tear apart everything they had worked for. Kirok's voice broke through the tension, his words measured but filled with anger. We cannot give you control over our resources. That is too great a price. The Deathworlder leader's gaze hardened. Then you will face your fate alone. We will not wait forever. For a moment, Kiruk felt his heart stop. The price was too much, too dangerous. If they refused, the galaxy would fall. But if they gave the Deathworlders what they wanted, their future would be enslaved by these beings they had summoned. The council members were in an uproar, voices rising, but Kiruk held up a hand for silence. "Are there any other options?" Lyra asked, her voice low, as though she were grasping at a last straw of hope. "No," the Deathworlder leader replied coldly. "You wanted our help. You will pay the price. Make your decision." The weight of the moment hung in the air. The choice was no longer just about survival. It was about everything the galaxy stood for. Kiruk could feel the pressure mounting, the eyes of his people on him, waiting for his decision. His mind raced, but there was no way out. "We have no choice," Kiruk said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "We accept your terms, but know this, Deathworlder, this galaxy will never forget the price you ask." The Deathworlder leader gave a sharp nod. "We do not seek your gratitude. We seek only survival." And with that, the Deathworlders began to take control. The galaxy had made its decision, but now it would have to live with the consequences of that choice. The consequence of the deal. The Deathworlders' grip on the galaxy tightened, their ships now an omnipresent shadow looming over every corner of space. With their demand met, the galaxy's leaders found themselves scrambling to adapt to a new and terrifying reality. The once proud civilizations, who had prided themselves on their unity and independence, now stood divided under the weight of their forced alliance with the Deathworlders. Kiruk paced through the Grand Council chamber, his mind clouded with unease. The decision to surrender control had been made, but the implications of that choice were far from clear. What had they truly agreed to? The Deathworlders had taken the most valuable resource in the galaxy, a rare element that powered advanced technologies, the very lifeblood of their civilizations, and now they controlled it. But what did they truly want with it? And at what cost would this alliance come? Lyra, who had once stood beside him as a trusted advisor, now seemed distant. She moved through the corridors with a look of quiet desperation, no longer the hopeful leader she had once been. Her eyes betrayed the same uncertainty that plagued Kiruk. "How much longer can we hold on?" Lyra asked as she caught up to him. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, as if afraid someone would hear her questioning their choices. "We don't know," Kiruk replied. "The Deathworlders are patient, but they're not merciful. If they decide they've taken enough, they could destroy everything we've worked for in an instant." "Is it even worth it?" Lyra asked, her words sharp with fear. "What if we end up like the others, broken, enslaved to them?" "I don't know," Kiruk said, the weight of the truth pressing on his chest. "But right now, we have no choice. We can only wait and see what they do next." Just then, a sharp tone echoed through the council chamber. A communication request had come through, and everyone present turned to look at the holoprojector, its blue light casting a cold glow across the room. The image that appeared was chilling. A Deathworlder, tall and imposing, his armored figure casting a long shadow. His eyes gleamed with the same coldness that had struck fear into every leader who had ever come into contact with him. "We have begun our work," the Deathworlder leader said, his voice a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the walls. "The resource is now fully under our control. Your civilizations will not function without it. And as for your people, they will find their place in our new order." Kiruk's heart sank. He had known this day would come, but hearing the words, hearing the finality in the Deathworlder's tone, was like a blow to the chest. "What do you want from us now?" Kiruk asked, his voice steadier than he felt. He had to keep his composure, for the sake of the galaxy. "Now," the Deathworlder leader replied, "you will do as we say. Your worlds will bend to our will. Your technologies will be at our disposal, and in return, you will live. Those who resist will not be spared." The room went silent. The cold finality in the Deathworlders' words hung in the air, suffocating every hope, every dream of independence the galaxy had ever had. The Deathworlders had taken what they wanted, and now they were making their demands clear. Kirok's mind raced. There had to be something they could do. But as he looked around the room, he saw the same fear mirrored in the faces of the council members. The alliance was fractured, but there was no room left for dissent. "We cannot resist them," Lyra said, her voice breaking the silence. "Not now. We have no power. We've given it all away." Kirok turned toward her, his eyes hard. "We still have our people. Our civilizations may have lost their autonomy, but we can still fight. We cannot let them think we are broken. We cannot let them erase everything we'd fought for." "But what can we do?" Lyra asked, her eyes pleading. "They control the very thing we need to survive." Kirok's gaze hardened. "There is always something we can do. We will find a way." But deep down, Kirok knew the truth. The Deathworlders had set their plan in motion, and the galaxy was caught in their grasp. Resistance would be difficult, if not impossible, but the will to fight, the spirit of survival, was not so easily extinguished. The Deathworlders had won the first round, but the war, whatever it would become, was far from over. And in the silence that followed, Kirok and Lyra shared a look. It wasn't one of hope. It wasn't one of certainty. It was a look that spoke of survival, because in the end, survival was all that mattered. For the galaxy, the battle was only just beginning. A spark of rebellion. The Deathworlders' rule had settled across the galaxy like a storm cloud, dark and unyielding. Every corner of the known universe felt the pressure of their dominance. And the people, the countless millions of beings who had once thrived in peace, could only wait. They were caught in a bind, unable to defy the oppressive might of their new masters, but unwilling to let their worlds become mere shadows of what they once were. But not everyone had succumbed to despair. A small faction of rebels, scattered and desperate, began to rise from the ashes. They were the ones who refused to bend, the ones who believed that the galaxy still held the spark of hope. They were few, but their hearts burned with the desire for freedom. Kirok had long feared this moment, the moment when the people of the galaxy would turn on each other, torn between their survival and their need to fight for what they had lost. He had kept the truth hidden from the council and the common people. He knew there were whispers of rebellion. But as the days dragged on, the whispers grew louder, and Kirok began to see the truth in the rumors. They were not just whispers anymore. They were a call to arms. It began on the planet of Naira, a world once known for its technological advancements and peaceful way of life. The Deathworlders had arrived and stripped it bare, taking all its resources and leaving the people broken. But Naira was not a world to be easily conquered. The people, though oppressed, still had a glimmer of the fire that had once made their world great. A message was sent, a cry for help, that reached the underground leaders who had been plotting in secret. The call was clear. They had had enough. The first coordinated attack came as a shock to the Deathworlders. The rebels, armed with stolen weapons and makeshift technology, launched an assault on one of the Deathworlder supply stations. It wasn't a grand victory. Far from it. The rebels were outmatched, outgunned, and outnumbered. But it was a start. The message was clear. The galaxy had not surrendered completely. There were those who would resist. News of the attack spread quickly across the galaxy, carried by the few remaining independent communication channels that had not been fully seized by the Deathworlders. And it didn't take long before other systems, other planets, began to rise in defiance. The rebellion was small, but it was growing, like the first signs of a storm on the horizon. Meanwhile, Kirok, who had been caught in the grip of hopelessness, found himself stirred by a sudden, unexpected feeling. A spark of something he hadn't dared to believe in for so long. Hope. He had always been the pragmatist, the one who spoke of surrender and survival. But now, seeing the flickering embers of resistance in the galaxy, he realized something. The Deathworlders' rule was not absolute. There was power in unity. There was strength in rebellion. But how far could they push back? The Deathworlder fleet was vast, their firepower overwhelming. They controlled the galaxy's lifeblood, resources, technology, and the very foundation of their civilizations. The rebels, no matter how fierce, could never hope to match that. But perhaps they didn't need to. Perhaps, if they could rally enough systems, enough people, they could spark something bigger, a fire that the Deathworlders couldn't snuff out. Kiruk knew what needed to be done. The first step was finding allies, those who still had the will to fight. He began reaching out to key figures across the galaxy, forming secret alliances with those who would stand against the Deathworlders. Some were former leaders of fallen civilizations, others were military commanders who had been driven underground. Together, they began planning their next move. The Deathworlders were not unbeatable, Kiruk reminded himself. They had their weaknesses, their vulnerabilities, and those were the things the rebels would exploit. But that would take time. Time they didn't have. "We can't waste any more time," Lyra said one evening as they sat in a hidden room aboard one of the last remaining independent ships. Her eyes were sharp, her mind focused. "The longer we wait, the stronger the Deathworlders become. We need to strike now." Kiruk nodded. He knew she was right. The rebellion had already begun, and there was no turning back. "We need to unite the systems. We need a coalition." "Then let's start small," Lyra suggested. "Start with the planets that are ready to fight. Bring them into the fold, one system at a time." And so, they set their plan in motion. Kiruk and Lyra would visit the most rebellious worlds, those that had already begun to resist, and offer them support. They would rally the people, ignite the fire of rebellion, and bring the galaxy's fractured factions together. But they knew the path would be perilous. The Deathworlders had eyes everywhere, and they would not tolerate dissent. Every move they made had to be calculated, every step taken with the utmost care. The first battle, though small, was a turning point. It was proof that the galaxy had not lost its will to fight. It was proof that there was still hope, still a chance for victory. As Kiruk stood on the bridge of the ship, staring out at the stars, he knew one thing for certain. The war for the galaxy was far from over. It had only just begun. The winds of change. The rebel forces were small, scattered, and vastly outmatched by the might of the Deathworlder fleet. But something had changed. The galaxy was no longer silent. The cry for freedom had been answered. And now, the stars themselves seemed to stir with the winds of rebellion. The Deathworlders had thought their dominance was unchallenged, that no one could stand against their might. But the galaxy had a secret that even they couldn't foresee, the will of its people. Kiruk stood at the head of the makeshift command table, his mind whirring with the plans that had been set into motion. The galaxy was now divided into two factions, those who bent the knee to the Deathworlders, and those who were ready to take up arms against them. It wasn't much, but it was a start. In the past weeks, Kiruk had traveled from one world to another, meeting with leaders, rallying rebels, and forging alliances. Each planet was different. Some had long since fallen into despair, while others still held on to the belief that they could make a difference. Some systems were barely hanging on, and the weight of war had pushed them to the brink of annihilation. Others, however, had become hotbeds of resistance, their people eager to fight back against the alien overlords. But even with all these small victories, the reality was clear. The Deathworlders were too powerful. Their ships were unmatched, their weapons devastating, and their tactics ruthless. The Deathworlders' fleet was a juggernaut, and the rebel forces, scattered and under-resourced, had no hope of standing toe-to-toe with them. But Kiruk was not one to give up easily. He had seen the will of the people, and he knew that the Deathworlders had made a mistake. They had underestimated the strength of the galaxy's inhabitants, the depth of their desperation, and the unshakable desire for freedom. The Deathworlders had believed they could control everything, but in doing so, they had ignited a fire that could not be easily extinguished. In a dark room aboard the rebel flagship, Kirok and Lyra huddled around a large map of the galaxy. Stars twinkled brightly on the screen, showing the locations of key rebel strongholds, and every movement made by the Deathworlders was being tracked. Their fleet was vast, but the rebel forces had a secret weapon: speed. Their ships, though fewer in number, were agile and capable of slipping through enemy lines. But they couldn't do it alone. "We need something more," Kirok muttered, his brow furrowed in thought. "Something that could level the playing field." Lyra, ever the strategist, was already thinking ahead. "We need to find a way to strike a decisive blow. A strike that will show the Deathworlders that we're not afraid. We need to take down one of their major ships, something that will send a message." Kirok nodded slowly. The rebels had no hope of defeating the Deathworlder fleet in a traditional battle, but if they could capture or destroy one of their flagship vessels, it could be a turning point, a single blow that would shake the Empire to its core. But how could they do it? The Deathworlder ships were heavily protected, and any attempt at direct assault would end in disaster. "I think we need to do something unexpected," Lyra said, breaking Kirok's train of thought. "We need to turn the Deathworlders' greatest strength against them." Kirok's eyes widened as he understood her meaning. They weren't going to fight them head-on. They weren't going to engage them in battle. They were going to sabotage the Deathworlders from within. "Betrayal," Kirok said, the word tasting bitter on his tongue. "We'll use their own forces against them." The plan was risky, bordering on madness, but it was the only one that might succeed. They would need to infiltrate one of the Deathworlder flagship ships, planting seeds of rebellion among their own ranks. They would need to gather intelligence, find weaknesses in the Deathworlders' command structure, and most importantly, sow out. If they could destabilize the Deathworlder fleet from within, it would be a far more effective strategy than facing them in open combat. "Are we ready for this?" Kirok asked, his voice heavy with the weight of the decision. Lyra's eyes met his, filled with resolve. "We don't have a choice. If we wait for the Deathworlders to strike first, we lose. But if we take the fight to them, we may just have a chance." And so the plan was set into motion. The rebels, though small and fractured, now had a purpose, an edge that the Deathworlders hadn't counted on. It wasn't just about the number of ships or weapons they had. It was about the hearts and minds of the galaxy's people. The Deathworlders had forced their hand, and now the galaxy's inhabitants would rise to meet the challenge. In the days that followed, the rebellion moved quickly. The first wave of spies infiltrated the Deathworlder fleets, silently spreading their message of rebellion. They sabotaged supply lines, weakened defenses, and most importantly, began planting the seeds of doubt within the Deathworlders' ranks. Slowly but surely, the cracks began to form. Kirok knew that the war was far from over. The Deathworlders would not go down easily. But the spark had been lit. The rebellion was no longer a scattered collection of weak resistance groups. It had become a movement, a galaxy-wide uprising. And as the first shots were fired in this new war, Kirok knew one thing for sure. The Deathworlders' reign had come to an end. The winds of change were blowing across the galaxy, and nothing would ever be the same again.